This is The Red Line, where we interview three geopolitical experts on one big issue shaping the news both here and overseas. And I'm your host, Michael Hilliard. We began 2024 with our episode taking a look at Russia's 6 fleets, conducting a full audit of the Russian Navy, and examining the challenges and obstacles it's likely to face in the coming years. So it feels only fitting that we conclude the year conducting a similar analysis of the United States Navy, as if expert estimates are to be believed, and the period where China is most likely to try and cross the Taiwan Strait and seize Taiwan is just a few years away in the 2027-2028 timeframe. This means that the ships being built today will likely form the backbone of the US Navy's cutting-edge capabilities during that crucial window. So given this, let's take a look at those ships in question. And we'll start with the new Constellation-class frigate. Now, the US has ordered 6 of these new guided missile frigates, with options to buy another 4 if they like the program. Well, unfortunately, due to shipbuilding problems, the Constellation-class program is already facing some pretty significant delays, currently running 36 months behind schedule, which is more than double the initial timeline estimate given in just March of 2024. Okay, so what about aircraft carriers? Well, the next US carrier in line is the Enterprise, a top-of-the-line Gerald Ford-class US carrier that was awarded in 2016 and laid down in 2022, and was initially planned for delivery in September of 2028. But unfortunately, well, that program is also running behind. In fact, 18 to 26 months behind schedule, with the shipbuilders in charge of this program also being in charge of other programs that are currently behind for the US Navy. In fact, when you read some of these reports, the estimates suggest that the Enterprise will likely miss its September 2029 delivery deadline. Okay, well, what about submarines? If we take a look at the Virginia-class attack submarines, well, they're also encountering delays. Block 4 of these Virginias is currently about 36 months behind schedule, and Block 5 is about 24 months behind schedule, with those delays also more likely to rise than fall, as there are a whole bunch of budgetary constraints, making it difficult to accelerate the program. Now, whilst all of that does sound somewhat alarming, these delays could be somewhat justified, as the US has placed a whole other program as its top naval building priority, that program being the US Columbia-class submarine. Now, the Columbia-class submarine has been the Navy's top priority since 2013, with the estimated total cost of the program being approximately $130 billion US. To support this effort, virtually every other US naval program has had at least some of their resources diverted away from them and toward the Columbia-class, in order to guarantee that the production of these submarines receives the best components and is given the highest priority within the US naval shipbuilding capability. And I can tell you, despite all these efforts, the Columbia program is still running 6 to 12 months behind schedule, with these delays currently being so bad that the program is now dangerously close to missing its first deployment and maiden mission deadline in 2031. And here's the problem. I can go on and on with examples like this. Whether it's the Columbia or the Constellation, the situation we're facing at the moment is emblematic of broader issues within the US naval shipbuilding industry, where currently 9 of the Navy's top shipbuilding programs are running delays of at least 1 to 3 years. And now I can already hear you asking, who is to blame for all this? Well, these are the issues we've been exploring for the last month here on the show, trying to figure out how the US got here, where the situation's likely to take us if nothing changes, and what can actually be done to fix it. And to help us understand all that, as well as why the US is in such a unique position here, we turn to our first guest.
Part 1. Shipping delays.
The United States of America was the predominant shipbuilder in World War II, and afterwards we had a massive surplus of ships.
John Konrad is the CEO of GCaptain, the most visited maritime news site following the developments within the US Navy and shipbuilding industry. John has not only managed large projects within the shipbuilding and maritime environments, but is also a regular contributor to various policy publications and a former sea captain within the US Coast Guard. So we're thrilled to have him on the program today.
Now, you have to understand that shipbuilding is only successful in nations that subsidize shipbuilding. And there were attempts after World War II to continue subsidies, but we had a large overproduction of ships. The Japanese government, and followed by the Korean government, did huge subsidies into the commercial shipbuilding sector and took a lot of that shipbuilding capacity away from the United States and away from Europe. The United States maintained naval shipbuilding, and that really got an injection of funding and interest during Reagan's buildup, the 600 ship Navy. But Reagan cut our subsidies for commercial shipbuilding. And then after the Reagan era in the 90s, we cut naval shipbuilding, leaving us without either going into the 2000s. Then we had the global war on terror, where funding really moved to supporting the efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we took our eyes off the ball. And then there was not very much interest in Congress. Republicans under Newt Gingrich cut the U.S. Merchant Marine and Fisheries Committee. It had a full committee in Congress that was removed. And the U.S. Maritime Administration, which is the federal entity in charge of shipbuilding, saw its budget continuously cut. So MARAD, the Maritime Administration, under Department of Transportation. If you look at the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, they have over 40,000 employees, where the sister agency, the U.S. Maritime Administration, has only 800, and about 300 of those are actually working in D.C. on policy. So even as we attempt to help shipyards, we do not have the interest in Congress. We don't have a maritime desk in the National Security Council, in the White House, and this federal agency is a shell of its former self.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here, and we'll probably have to do it over a few questions. Historically, right up until around the 1980s, for the Navy's ships, the US either relied heavily on public shipyards or provided massive subsidies to the private ones, with the US also producing ships for other countries in the world and having a fairly bustling private sector. But today, the entire industry has shifted. The US no longer provides anywhere near the same subsidies for private shipbuilders, and as a result, the production of private ships for industry, in other words, building things like cargo ships, almost the entire demand has moved overseas. Largely because producers overseas not only produce the product quicker, but also much cheaper than the US can. And let's look at some of these numbers. As today, 51% of the world's private ship construction is done in China, 26% in South Korea, about 14% in Japan, 5% in Europe, and the US makes up less than 1% of the production figures today. And these days, what remains of the US private shipyards are all almost entirely focused on military production, with it often being that their only customer is the US Department of Defense. And you'd think with much less work coming into the industry, most of these shipyards would have more time to focus on what the DoD's demands are. But the reality is that almost all of these projects the US is involved with are usually both massively delayed and massively over budget. Across the episode, we're going to dive much deeper into the myriad of reasons why this is. But I think to first start with, can you give us some of the fundamental factors that are driving these delays we're seeing in the market?
Well, we have almost two completely separate problems. On the commercial maritime side is important because shipyards can be moved from commercial to Navy. So without that industrial base on the commercial side, you can't surge naval shipbuilding. But on the commercial side, there has been a cut in the resources for shipbuilding. On the naval side, we have the exact opposite problem. On the Navy side, we've absolutely increased because the military, when they run into problems, what they do is they put more people and they put more resources into a problem.
And this is a significant part of the issue, as while in countries like Japan, South Korea, and China, their shipyards maintain a balance between producing military and civilian vessels, allowing them to pivot their production based on the demand at the time. In other words, if military orders end up being reduced, well, then these shipyards can simply just shift to building commercial ships, keeping most of their workforce employed and their facilities operational. And then during periods when there is more military demand, well, then they can pick up extra workers who are already skilled at the job working in the commercial sector and simply shift them over to working on military projects, avoiding having to find brand new workers or retraining staff for the job. as even for military purposes, the majority of shipbuilding is roughly the same between the commercial and military sectors. Obviously, there's going to be a lot more specialized equipment in military ships, but the majority of it is still just a big floating vessel. Now, in contrast, if we then take a look at US shipyards, and those ones being almost entirely focused on military production, they don't have any of that civilian sector to divert staff towards. And this creates a bit of a vulnerability, as if the US DoD or Congress cancels a project, or reduces the number of ships under request, or even just delays payments, these private shipyards often have no alternative work to assign their workforce. They're either building that US submarine, or they're just simply not working. And being private companies looking to squeeze the most out of every dollar, under the system you also find that these shipyards only hire just the amount of staff they need, and only just the amount of materials they need. As buying extra materials or having more staff sitting around just in case, for a private company is just bleeding money. So any delays in payments or cancellation of projects will often push the company's shareholders to simply pull the plug on any project, or demand more money from the government to account for the delays caused by the government. And with it being a private board or shareholders that are the ones making the demands on these shipyards, they're also likely to be much quicker at laying off staff and reducing operations, and much slower to upgrade facilities, buy that extra warehouse just in case, or forward order materials so that they're in the warehouse ready to go for when the contract's supposed to start. Now, I know when most people think of US defense companies, they often don't think of them as poor entities. When you picture the major players like Raytheon or Boeing, whose aerospace and defense divisions generate billions of dollars annually, them crying poor is probably not the easiest message. So what's so fundamentally different about these US shipyards? Why are they the ones having these massive budgetary issues?
Well, these commercial shipyards, they are public companies that are underfunded and under-resourced. And they are not necessarily the priority of the parent company. So you have the biggest being General Dynamics, has Electric Boat in Groton, Connecticut. They have NASCO in San Diego. Well, that is not really a profit center for General Dynamics. They also build tanks for the Army, and they build private jets, Gulfstream jets. Those jets are the profit source. So when the company is resourcing, where are they going to invest money? A commercial company with shares on the stock exchange is going to put that investment dollars into the segments that are profitable, that return on shareholders. And others have tried to spin off. So HII, which built submarines and our nuclear aircraft carrier, that spun off from a defense major. But when it did, the total size of the company is tiny compared to these large defense contractors. So you have the Lockheed Martins, the Boeings, they have over $100 billion market cap, the total value of their shares each, where HII, our shipbuilder that was spun off, has less than a $10 billion market cap. Well, what does that do for HII? It means that when it tries to borrow money to build dry docks, to expand capacity, to hire people, it is undervalued and has to raise money on the junk bond market. That makes financing very difficult. And the Navy, all they can do is increase the size of the purchase. So the Navy increases the purchase price to try to give money back to these commercial shipyards in order to build ships. So the Navy just increases the cost of the ship, but it does not understand the Wall Street aspects and this Department of Transportation problem.
Now, the American shipbuilding market today includes quite a variety of specialized players, each of them having fairly unique roles, funding structures, and geographic locations. For instance, you have Huntington Ingalls Industries, or HII, them being the largest military shipbuilder in the US. Now, those guys are responsible for constructing nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, some amphibious assault ships, and a few other bits and pieces. Then below them is General Dynamics Electric Boat, headquartered in Connecticut, with these guys primarily focusing on nuclear-powered submarines, including the construction of the new Columbia-class ballistic missile submarines and the Virginia-class. But below those guys, you do have some of these smaller players, like Fincantieri Marionette Marine, with these shipbuilders being based 1,200 miles inland from Norfolk in the crucial political swing state of Wisconsin, with FMM specializing in building frigates and littoral combat ships. Now, as we can see, these firms are distributed right across the country, with most of these shipyards being established either close to a major US naval base, close to a US coastal city, or occasionally within pretty odd locations, many of which also coincidentally align with the home district or home state of the politician at the head of the committee in charge of who gets the funding. But can you unpack the dynamics here a little bit more? Take us through how each of these guys differs from one another.
That's an excellent question. Well, there are three types of shipbuilding companies. The first and our largest, as I said, was HII and General Dynamics. These are publicly listed companies. They issue stock, right? And particularly General Dynamics is part of a larger conglomerate. So what needs to be done with those larger conglomerate companies is you have to convince the Army and the Air Force to stand behind you and redirect those resources in the large conglomerate to shipbuilding, which is difficult to do. And then the secondary is the publicly listed like HII, which just do shipbuilding. Well, for there, the person you have to convince is not the conglomerate board members. It is the bankers, Wall Street, the Goldman Sachs, the JP Morgans. And then finally, the most troubled segment is our privately held companies that are not on the stock market. These are smaller companies. Some of them are family owned. Some of these do excellent work, but they're almost completely frozen out because the rules and regulations under the SEC and the Treasury in order to get these financing. So you have huge disproportionate amounts of investing.
Now, while some of these companies may receive some substantial payouts up front, and the Navy may even allocate more funding than they initially requested to try and incentivize some flexibility here, these are, at the end of the day, still private companies, meaning that ultimately they're beholden to their shareholders more than they're beholden to the Navy, which, as you can imagine, does create some points of tension, as particularly if they have fiduciary responsibilities. These companies are often going to be pretty reluctant to spend anything beyond the minimum amount required. For instance, if the Navy intervenes into a project and issues a delay, or requests some change to the system mid-production, well, the production managers and the staff in the warehouses, well, they might be willing to pause and do that and adapt the system to what the Navy requires. However, these shareholders, who are always going to push for cost-cutting measures, are going to try and protect their bottom line. And when they see that they have 100 staff just sitting around doing nothing, are going to either start putting staff on very casual contracts, producing uncertainty within the workforce, or simply lay off staff and try and rehire people back when the project does get back underway. And being private entities, these companies also have other options open to them as well. For instance, they can declare bankruptcy, they can outsource portions of the work to other companies, or simply just extend the project and delay parts of it. As well, it's a bit of a dirty secret within procurement, but all of the major players within the industry pretty frequently and persistently often overpromise and under-budget during the tender phase of the contract. In other words, when they're bidding between companies to try and get that work, often exaggerating how quickly and cheaply they can produce that project, knowing that once that contract ends up signed and awarded, there's very little the government can do about it, meaning there's very little accountability for missed deadlines, ballooning costs, and politicians are often pretty reluctant to cancel projects and admit that they spent the money incorrectly. And this is a reality that has been plaguing numerous high-profile defense programs for decades now, meaning that even when companies are handed a large sum of money up front, and the executives don't just award themselves massive bonuses, there is no guarantee a project's going to succeed under this system. Now, obviously, I'd love to go through a real-world example of this, so do you have one in mind that you could take us through?
Biggest example of this is VT Halter. VT Halter was owned by a Singaporean company who put hundreds of millions of dollars into investment of dry docks and tooling and the yard. And they had, I believe it was $9 billion in government contracts. So they put the money in and they had government contracts, but their primary contract was this icebreaker, which got caught in the NAVSEA development cycle and was delayed. And the delays got to such a point where the Singaporean company said, we just cannot make money unless we get ships built. It doesn't matter how much those contracts are. If that hull is sitting in your yard and it's not getting out the door, there is no turnover. So VT Halter, despite these hundreds of millions of dollars of investment, despite the $9 billion in contracts, they sold the entire yard for $16 million just to get away from this Navy bureaucracy.
And this is often the point where both government and industry begin to start pointing fingers at one another. blaming the other for the delays that happen in these projects. Now, if you ask these shipbuilders, one of the most consistent complaints that you get in the construction of these ships is that designs are often put into practice before they're finalized. This means that as shipbuilders start work on the hulls and the critical systems, the Navy, Congress, the Department of Defense, and even some outside committees can repeatedly step in and modify the blueprints as they're under construction, with these changes often involving adjusting the ship's capabilities, swapping out armament systems, or even entirely redefining what the vessel's role will be. And as you can expect, this creates a whole bunch of chaos right down the manufacturing chain, and happens far more often than most people probably realize. So let's take for an example the Constellation-class frigates. Now originally the plan by Department of Defense was to go really simple with it, the plan being to purchase and adopt the proven French-Italian design for the frigate, and that they'd only make minimal changes here and there. That way the plans were ready to go, and they could move straight into production, avoiding a whole bunch of these really costly change orders. But as input came in from the Navy and the DoD and Congress and other stakeholders, the design underwent consistent revisions. And by the time the production actually began, not only had the project been delayed by 3 years, but only about 15% of the original design actually made it to the final run. And when you start thinking about it, making changes to some of these ships is often a lot more difficult than people assume. Because whilst on that blueprint it might seem like there's a big empty cavity there that something could be put into, as any tradesperson will tell you, those cavities are often godsends for cabling, piping, and all sorts of stuff that's been fed through there. Meaning that when you're 2 years into production and then decide you want to put an extra VLS system in, well, without knowing it may require air conditioning systems to be pulled out, cabling to be redone, or other critical infrastructure parts to be completely overhauled. And when you realize that most of these private companies will often rely on outside tradespeople or hiring in outside equipment to do those jobs, the costs very quickly begin to spiral. These shipbuilders will often blame Congress for a lot of these delays, often accusing Congress of having an 80% go trigger, where they announce now and plan later. And admittedly, it is pretty easy to see how this happens, as congressmen, who in the US often only have 2-year terms, have a built-in incentive to, before the election, announce these new projects, announce those extra jobs coming into the district, and announce that they're tough on defense, even if the project hasn't been completed or finalized yet. After all, if they win, they can fix it then. And if they lose, well, it's not their problem now anyway. So all of these politicians, whether it is the United States or elsewhere, are under political pressure to prioritize visible progress and announcements over long, boring, proper planning. And so understandably, when a project goes into construction with only 80% of the blueprints done, there are always going to be a flood of change orders coming in mid-construction. Now, I want to get a better idea on how serious this problem is. So can you take us through a major project like an aircraft carrier? On a project of that size, how many change orders could that company expect to see come through?
Our last carrier, the Ford class, had 16,000 change orders. And when you have that many delays, it affects the cycle. So this Singaporean company was not able to get the financing in order to get through these delays. And the delays were cutting into their profitability because they're not getting paid until those ships are delivered. And the ships kept getting delayed. So it was this vicious cycle, and they sold for pennies on the dollar.
Now, of course, from there, Congress would likely argue that the ability to issue change orders is pretty essential for maintaining flexibility and adaptability within the fleet, and that this system of allowing changes allows them to adjust each ship's design mid-construction to incorporate new emerging technologies, addressing new threats, and shift production towards different classes of vessels, based on whatever's needed at the time. And that while these changes undeniably do cause delays, this setup does offer the flexibility to enhance or cancel projects whenever they become a liability or exceed their budgets. At least, well, that's the theory. As that said, recent programs like the Zumwalt class or the Littoral Combat Ship program, well, both of those programs may suggest that flexibility may not always lead to the best outcomes, as both of these programs, which we'll again dive into a bit later, suffered from absolutely spiraling costs, significant delays, massive design changes, and in the end, ultimately delivered ships that fell pretty short of their original operational goals. For example, the Zumwalt class, initially envisioned to be a revolutionary multi-role destroyer, ended up being reduced to a fleet of just 3 vessels for a total cost of $23 billion. much of this expense coming from all these changes and a lot of redesigns. And in that same vein, the LCS program, which when originally brought to the table was intended to provide a low-cost, highly versatile platform, has since faced a lot of persistent criticism for its limited capabilities and high maintenance cost, being nowhere near as flexible as it was advertised, and at the same time having weaponry that's far too expensive to use. After all, while it is possible to shoot every drone out of the sky, it's not exactly financially responsible if you're forced to launch a $15 million SM-3 missile to take down a $500 Alibaba drone. Now, both these programs ran way over cost, and whilst we have been able to reassign some of these boats to other roles in the Navy, it's pretty hard to argue that they got the proper bang for buck here. So if the appeal of this private system is how much flexibility we do have in it, why wouldn't Congress have pulled the plug on this years ago?
The Zumwalt particularly and the LCS, they looked at platforms for future weapons where they could put on lasers, where they could put on these advanced gun systems. That technology was not ready yet. So they thought, hey, we're going to build these hulls and put this technology on later. But that is very difficult to do as R&D budgets were cut and priority was moved from the naval side into things in the global war on terror in Iraq and Afghanistan, where we had to look at putting greater armor on our Humvees and improved tanks and improved helicopters. Well, that R&D budget got cut from the Navy. And so shipbuilders are like, we can build these hulls, but the hulls are going to sit there without these advanced lasers, advanced deck guns, advanced technology. And Congress saw that and said, why are we building these hulls? And they took two separate approaches. With the Zumwalt, they cut down to just 3 ships. And in the LCS, they said, hey, we are going to continue these ships and we're going to continue building a lot of them, but we're going to figure out the modularity package later. Both ideas failed. We still haven't invested in the research and development to outfit these LCS, littoral combat ships, with advanced technology. And without these advanced packages, they can't even do what they were designed to do, which was fight a small threat like the Houthis in the Red Sea. They just don't have the missile capabilities. And the Zumwalt, we are now removing the gun systems and we're putting on hypersonic missiles, which is good, but we only have 3 of these ships. And the shipbuilders, they can build the hulls, but they can't build up those advanced radars. And it's very difficult to retrofit a ship after as these technologies change.
Well, I'm sure that most of the congressmen and congresswomen who get briefings on this subject must be aware of the problems within the shipbuilding industry. So what's actually preventing action from being taken?
Well, the biggest problem is Congress has not been focused on the shipbuilding problem. They have been focused on the Army problems, particularly these land wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and around the world. And subsequent to that, secondary attention has been on air platforms because the United States only dominates in 3 industries in the world where we have market share, and those are agriculture, technology, and aviation. So the interest from Congress, and again, dual purpose, any money going into aviation is going to benefit not just the Air Force, but it's going to benefit the commercial sector, which will add onto GDP. So the Navy has been 3rd in interest from the Congress. And when the Congress does build a large ship, they want to outsource these part suppliers, these thousands of suppliers around the country, so that each congressional district has a piece of this large ship that is being built. But the problem is that most of Congress is not interested in shipbuilding. They are interested in that maybe small supplier, but that small supplier is dwarfed by the problems that congressional members have in larger things. If you're in North Dakota, for example, it would be oil and gas that takes up your interest. If you are in Iowa, it's agriculture. So this is just becomes a secondary and tertiary concern. And there's a growing interest within Congress. But again, it's not the top priority. As Waltz goes into the White House National Security Council, we're hoping to see a maritime desk. We're hoping to see the reindustrialization. But he has problems now with Syria, and he has focus on the Russia-Ukraine war, these things take priority. So every congressman wants more parts manufacturers in their district, but the problem is priority. The shipbuilding never gets the number one priority, and things that aren't on a top 5 priority list for the White House, for Congress, just get kicked down the road. And we do not have an abundance of time. Time is the one critical component that we, as America, as the greatest nation on earth, just do not have enough of to get these ships built.
And one could definitely make the argument that the US's political system really doesn't incentivize that kind of long-term thinking. Now, an example of what I'm talking about here is that whilst you can go speak with military and intelligence professionals, and a good chunk of them will have a looming concern over the 2027-2028 pinch point with China, the prevailing attitude in Washington by a lot of people seems to be something along the lines of, well, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. That even whilst they might acknowledge some of the problems within the shipbuilding industry, and the fact that there are these massive cost overruns, the issue always seems to fall into the too hard basket. So what I want to ask is, let's say we go with that attitude and we try and cross the bridge when we get to it, and decided that they need to treat this issue with the urgency it deserves. How long do you think it would realistically take to actually ramp up the US shipbuilding capacity to a point where ships were being produced on time and the US began reheating their benchmarks?
Well, you have to look at history for an answer. We tried to do that in World War I and we ramped up, and most of those shipbuilding projects did not come to completion until after the war was finished. It takes years to build a ship. In World War II, we really dominated. Well, that's because of the Merchant Marine Act of 1936. So 6 years prior to getting into the war, we really did that congressional act to start expanding shipbuilding, because it's not just about building out those dry docks and the shipyards. It's about that industrial base. It's about the workforce. This takes time to produce. You can I wouldn't say it's easy, but it's relatively easy to retool a truck manufacturer to produce Humvees or tanks because we have those factories. We don't have the shipyards, and we don't have all of these part suppliers that can be ramped up quickly. So if there was a war starting tomorrow, it's going to take 2 years minimum to start ramping up the production, and that's if everything goes well.
Now, many US political and defense officials seem to have a tendency to use historical examples as templates for future strategies, particularly when it comes to this sort of industrial policy or industrial mobilization. And a common reference I have seen pointed out is when US officials point to the sheer output of aircraft carriers and warships that effectively won them the Second World War, particularly when it came to the Pacific. That when the US ramped up its arms industry, it was so strong and so robust that it was able to not only supply its own military, but also aid Britain and supply a huge chunk of the Soviet military as well, particularly under the Lend-Lease program, which drove up demand on the US side and allowed the US to push even more men and material into the arms industry. But as our previous guest pointed out, most of those programs that the US implemented to begin that ramp up in arms production began as early as 1936. With the US then signing the Lend-Lease Act in March of 1941, and from there entering the war in December 1941, a full 5 years after the initial ramp-ups began. So if the more pessimistic analysts are right, and 2027 is the pinch point with China, the US would have needed to begin a significant shipbuilding ramp-up roughly about 3 years ago. So the critical question still remains. What can be fixed? What obstacles are currently sitting in the way of that? And what does the timeline look like today? And to answer all that, we turn to our second guest.
Part 2. Congressional Consumers.
Once the Soviet Union fell, the US had its unipolar moment. It was the only great power left in the world, and it didn't really foresee that there would be any big conflicts coming up with a peer competitor. So what happened then was that the Clinton administration at the time didn't think it was necessary to be spending huge amounts on defense. And what they would do instead is take some of that funding and redirect it towards other domestic matters like education, healthcare, and so on, which meant that the defence budget from the beginning of the Clinton administration onwards fell quite substantially. And obviously, without defence spending, you don't have defence orders. So the number of ships being built in the Clinton administration really started to drop off, both in surface ships and submarines. So everything got smaller. All of the yards started to rationalise their facilities because they didn't have the orders on the books.
Emma Salisbury is an expert in naval history and the modern naval military-industrial complex, as well as being a Sea Power Research Fellow at the Council on Geostrategy, a Fellow at the Defence Futures think tank, and the assistant editor at the publication War on the Rocks. Emma is highly regarded as one of the most knowledgeable analysts when it comes to the costs, production, and timelines in the naval shipbuilding industry. And so we're thrilled to have on the program today.
A lot of the problem here is the problem of capacity. And when you lose capacity, it's very, very difficult to get it back. And I think we've seen that almost everywhere in the West, particularly with the context of Ukraine. You're starting to see that Western countries want to be producing more ships, more ammunition, more guns, more tanks, whatever it is, but they don't have that industrial capacity left to be able to do that quickly. So although defence spending has risen again since the 1990s, that capacity doesn't come back as quickly.
All right, so we did touch on this a bit earlier, but from what it seems, the situation here isn't entirely the fault of one side or the other, and both sides have contributed to this issue. And it seems that one of the only things that both sides can really agree upon is that the US shipbuilding industry needs more funding. But I want to get your perspective on this. If we were to simply just throw a bunch more money at the problem, how effectively do you think that would solve the issue here?
I don't think it would be unwelcome. There's a lot you can do with just a ton of money. The big thing would be recapitalising the actual manufacturing sites themselves, so the shipyards. A lot of the sites were rationalised after the end of the Cold War because these private companies, there's no reason for them to invest in maintaining or expanding their facilities if they don't have the orders. So an injection of government money, I personally would use to either to incentivise or to frankly pay for the recapitalisation of those shipyards to get rid of some of that capacity problem. But a lot of the problem here is that because these things take time, this is all stuff that should have been done 10 years ago. And the problem with shipbuilding especially is ships are really big. They take big facilities. They take complicated manufacturing processes, a really skilled workforce, a lot of materials. And trying to put all that back together does take time.
Now, as much as it's the government paying these companies, they do remain private entities, which means they're driven by profit and accountable to their shareholders. And whilst there are a whole bunch of issues that do contribute to the delays, with things like labour shortages and change orders, I want to focus on just one of them for now, which is supply chain issues and the just-in-time manufacturing system. You see, unlike in the past, when shipyards maintained large stockpiles of steel, spare parts, materials all ready to go, the modern shipbuilding industry has adopted the same system that most other manufacturers have, with a just-in-time supply chain, where materials are only ordered as they're needed. So a shipbuilder will only buy enough steel for what exists there on the blueprint. Now, this approach is very common across a whole bunch of industries because it saves money on storage and prevents overbuying materials and then having them go to waste later. But it does introduce a bit of a risk into the system, as if there's any design changes or unexpected disruptions, it does then force companies to go reorder those materials, which, to put in perspective, the lead time for the high-grade steel used in shipbuilding these days can be anywhere between 6 to 12 months in delays. On top of that, when you look at specialty components such as gas turbines, radar systems, or vertical launch systems, VLS, they can take even longer to produce or acquire and get into the system. And from there, if a manufacturer is on a very secretive project, like a submarine, they may also be forced into keeping a completely documented and secure supply chain. In other words, if you need a couple of screws, you can't just go down to the hardware store and grab some. You need to buy it from specialty trusted suppliers who can guarantee where those screws are at all times and have documentation the whole way. Now, for the government, the ideal solution would be to have these companies maintain pretty massive buffer stocks of critical materials, order lots of steel up front and just go back to the warehouse and grab what you need as you need it. However, private companies are understandably reluctant to do that, as they don't want to take on the financial risks of warehousing this excess inventory, or cover the costs if the government scales back a project or just cancels it outright. So what incentive could the government actually provide these companies to convince them to move away from those production chains and take the faster but far less profitable route?
I think the incentive you really have to give private companies is profit. Obviously, it's a capitalist system. Companies need to provide profit for their shareholders. So the way I think to do that better is to commit to a long-term order book. So if these companies know that they are going to be building, say, 2 ships every year for the next 15 years, that gives them an incentive to invest that money in their facilities, in their manufacturing, in their workforce, to be able to make profit off of those orders. A lot of the problems we've seen with US shipbuilding in particular have been that the Navy and the civilian leadership are finding it really difficult to decide how many ships they want to build and over what time period. So there is a bit of a chicken and egg scenario here where the shipbuilding capacity doesn't exist to build these ships, but that shipbuilding capacity is not incentivized if you don't plan to build those ships. So it's very much a problem ultimately of political will here to commit to a substantial shipbuilding program with the funding behind it from Congress, the DoD, the US Navy, etc., and then to use that as a solid plan that will not change. And that's obviously very difficult in a democracy because once an administration changes, they might want something completely different.
Now, this system of placing steady, much longer term orders has proven pretty effective for countries like Japan, where the Japanese submarine building industry does tend to produce smaller, less complex submarines, but that the submarines they do produce are high quality, usually closer to budget, and often come out pretty consistent with the timelines proposed. As these Japanese companies tend to benefit from a very consistent turnover in revenue and vessels, so they can go to their suppliers and ask for deals on this much steel coming in every month or every year, as well as ensuring that all of their expertise and good labor force are kept employed in guaranteed long contracts. In fact, as another example of this point, one of the only projects the US shipbuilding industry currently has that is running on time is not the next upcoming carrier, the Enterprise, but the carrier after that, the Doris Miller. The key factor here being that the US placed the order for these 2 carriers at once, which allowed the shipyards at HII to pre-book and pre-order materials, start assembling some of their workforce a bit earlier, with any staff unable to get started on that carrier, then being able to be pushed onto the first one, and begin to plan much longer term for how they're going to use these shipyards. So Congress does have a lot of power to be able to actually speed up and help the industry here. But saying that, Congress also has a lot of power to create disruptions as well, as beyond influencing how much in the long-term contracts, Congress, along with the DoD and a whole bunch of other agencies, also have the ability to influence what gets built. And as a bit of a classic example here, and something we'll probably do an entire episode on sometime in the future, but if we look at something like the M1 Abrams tank program, the US built so many of these tanks. There was a point where the DoD and the Pentagon came back and said, we don't need any more tanks, and they're mostly just sitting around costing us a lot of money in maintenance. And whilst it may have been logical to listen to the Department of Defense at that point, Congress overruled their recommendations and kept ordering tanks, mostly because the production of these tanks had been split up and structured across a whole bunch of very marginal constituencies, with factories building a barrel over here, some of the treads over here, the engines over here, etc., making sure that if that project were to get cancelled, it would cost a lot of jobs in a lot of key marginal districts. And now all of this then gets further complicated by Congress when you start including issues like the debt ceiling and federal budget cuts, as these things often spook shipyards and suppliers, causing delays and uncertainties, which in turn then ups the cost of material procurement, workforce planning, and overall production timelines. So I know it's a hard question, but how do you address these challenges and prevent some of this meddling that has been done by Congress over the years that has caused problems in defense manufacturing without also getting rid of the oversight that Congress does put into the industry, whilst at the same time making sure there is some public oversight into how these industries are spending their money?
I mean, speaking as a Brit, the US defense budget process just baffles me completely. Having defense spending that has to be passed by Congress line by line every single year just seems to me to be a really stupid way of doing long-term projects, because there is always the risk every single year that your project's going to be cancelled or cut or minimised or whatever, or that their defence budget won't be passed at all and it will be funded by continuing resolution or whatever other plan has been put in place to get round whatever Congress is doing. So that level of uncertainty is kind of baked into the defence budget process. Whereas in the UK, for example, the defence budget is rolled into the budget for the government, and all of that is voted on at once with one vote, yes or no. And parliamentarians don't have the option to specifically vote down lines of that defence budget. So the executive has a lot more control over long-term planning. Whether any British government has done that well is another question, but it's not due to the defence budget process. Arguably, the US way of doing things does mean that there's more scrutiny, there's more accountability, but actually, practically speaking, I think it's gone too far that way, where the amount of uncertainty in the defence planning process has become so high because there is this risk that the Senate will take a disliking to your plane project and then suddenly it's gone and you've invested all of this money in the project and it's not happening anymore. So it really does build in a real difficulty in being able to do long-term planning in the US. And that is an issue because, as I said, these facilities, especially for shipbuilding, are very expensive. They're very big. They take a lot of planning and investment in themselves. And no private company is going to spend all that time and money to build a modern new shipyard if then all the ships get cancelled and they've just got this lovely shipyard with nothing happening in it.
Many people may not fully realise the significant ripple effects that cancelling or delaying defence projects can have on the broader defence industry, and that what Congress does and says has wider effects than what they probably realise. Now, just to illustrate this for a moment, let's look at the recent fallout from the rollbacks in aid to Ukraine. Now, for many in the defence sector, the war in Ukraine came as a real wake-up call for them, exposing just how vulnerable the Western supply chains had become and how difficult it would be to ramp up production if the US were ever to find itself at war. As prior to 2022, most of the defence industries were producing just barely enough to replace the losses acquired through training and routine expenditures, with very little capacity built in to scale up from there. So when President Biden initially announced some of these funding packages, many defence companies in the US and abroad took it as a signal to invest in expansion. And a lot of them began the process of hiring new staff, ordering extra materials, and upgrading some of their facilities. As for some factories, they figured they'd be making 10-15 times as much artillery ammunition as they once were. And for the first 6 months of the US support here, when the war in Ukraine had bipartisan congressional backing, everything seemed fine. Companies were willing to take on extra risk, and production really began to scale up right across both the US and Europe. However, as the war dragged on, particularly in the US, the war in Ukraine became more and more of a partisan issue, with increasing numbers of representatives stating that they would cut the funding to the program. And with that, a lot of defense companies began to worry, starting to not only put their expansions on hold, but also began to restructure their invoices to protect themselves just in case. Now, it's a bit of a side note, but to really understand the problem, we need to break down the difference between fixed and variable costs. Now, if you're a defense company looking to start up a new factory to make shells for the war, your fixed costs are things that remain the same regardless of how many shells you make. This being things like buying that new factory, the interest you're paying on the loans to the factory, some of your insurances, and a handful of your core staff. That's your fixed costs. Now, variable costs are the costs that change based on the levels of production. So in this category, you'd find things like the brass you need to buy for the ammunition, the majority of your labor costs, shipping costs, as well as things like biscuits for the tea room. In other words, with your variable costs, the more shells you make, the larger the costs. And with that in mind, here's where this vicious cycle begins. Because when the defense companies began to worry that Congress would cut their funding, a lot of them would begin restructuring their invoices in anticipation of contracts being cut. So for example, if a defense company knows that the contract's going to last 10, 15 years, well, then they're going to be much more willing to spread those fixed costs out over a much longer period. So for the sake of the argument, they commit to producing 1 million bullets for $1 million. However, if that company then fears that contracts are going to end early, or may only last a year and then be cancelled, they're either going to build in massive cancellation fees, in which case they can usually make more money holding off production as long as they can and then waiting for the cancellation fee to kick in, or they're going to try and recoup all of their fixed cost losses as early in the cycle as possible. So in other words, they might charge $750,000 for the first 100,000 bullets, or roughly $7.50 a bullet. That way, even if Congress cancels the contract at the end of the first year, they've still recouped most of their losses. And here's where we hit that vicious cycle, because companies understandably want to build that risk into their invoices. But the congressman on the other side now watches these invoices for the first year go from $1 a bullet to $7.50 a bullet, and therefore have much more risk of cancelling a project, which then just drives more risk into the contract, which then increases the chance of cancelling the project. And again, that's a little bit off the track from today's conversation here, but it should give you an idea about how rhetoric and threats do make themselves into the price when it comes to the defense industry. Now, Emma, how do we find the balance here? Because whilst I agree that yes, we should have a robust oversight provided by Congress, how do we make sure that it also doesn't have disastrous impacts on the US's ability to actually produce defense materials? Surely having Congress here serves as a safety net to prevent these projects spiraling out of control.
So the problem with that argument is that there are a lot of projects that should have been cancelled that also weren't by Congress. So if you look at something like the F-22 Raptor, the Obama administration was trying to cancel it for a long time because they felt it was unnecessary to build any more of them, especially because the F-35 was coming in, and Congress deliberately stopped them from doing it. So it kind of goes both ways, that Congress can cancel things that need to be cancelled, but can also stymie the cancellation of things that need to be cancelled. So I don't think that the way the system works is set up to bias towards either way. I think it means that uncertainty can go either way. I think there must be a happy medium somewhere where the presidential administration can commit to long-term projects via the DoD and have congressional oversight over those, but not have that level of annual line-by-line uncertainty over whether those programs will continue or not, but yet have some mechanism in there for Congress to be able to hold those projects to account if they do need to be cancelled.
The other political issue that can come about here is short-term thinking, particularly when it comes to repair and upkeep costs for the Navy, as whilst members of Congress are incentivized to make flashy announcements, brag about a new ship going into production, building a new factory, or the big announcement of a major defense project, even if it's not really ready to go into announcement, things like repair and upkeep are far less sexy to announce, all of which is then exacerbated by budgetary issues, as when budgets get tight and the office above you is demanding you slash money out of your budget, for a congressman or someone thinking only in the short term, it can be pretty tempting to then just delay some of that required maintenance by a year or two and free up the funds you're about to spend on that for whole other priorities, whether they be pet projects for yourself or your constituency, or brand new military projects you can announce to the press. But the trouble with delaying maintenance is it actually costs you a lot more in the long run. And when you kick the can down the road, it makes the problem exponentially worse for the next government. To give a bit of a metaphor here, think of it a bit like a car. If you take your car to the mechanic today, your routine service might be $100. But if you put it off for a month, well, that dirty air filter may put some clog in the system, and now you've got to pay $200 to fix a couple of other things. But if you then put that repair off for an entire year, well, now you're going to have to pay thousands because you never put fresh oil in and you destroyed an engine. So whilst delaying maintenance might save you some money in the very short term, it makes it exponentially more expensive in the long term. And this is a principle that we're seeing right across naval assets at the moment. And as an example, the US Navy currently faces a backlog of over $1.8 billion in deferred maintenance for its ships and submarines. With some of these costs coming from congressmen just kicking the can down the road, others coming from there being just a massive backlog in the system and not being able to clear through these fast enough, with other delays simply just stacking up, as maintenance used to be one of the last things that US public shipyards did. Something that became a lot harder to do when their funding was dramatically cut under the Reagan administration, saw further cuts during the Bush Senior and Clinton administrations, saw more cuts during the Bush Jr. administration, and saw cuts during the Obama administration upon losing Congress in 2010. And whilst there has been a slight uptick during the Trump and Biden administrations, a lot of that money that's gone into the program since 2018 has failed to materialize into real actionable assets, with some of the public shipyards still using maintenance facilities built during the Second World War. Now, a lot of this to me seems to stem from short-term thinking, and again, somewhat understandable if you're only elected to 2-year terms. But how do we try and work around or remove the incentive that's currently built into the system that keeps perpetuating this short-term thinking?
I think if I could answer that question, I would be a lot happier, because I honestly don't know how you remove that incentive. The bias towards short-term thinking in government is huge, whether that's in the US or the UK or anywhere else in Europe. And the defence industry has been a casualty of that for the last 30 years. And that is the fundamental root cause of problems, not only in the Navy, but the Army and the Air Force as well, is that short-termism, because your incentive as a democratically elected government is very constrained to your term, so 4 years, 5 years, and you don't have an incentive to think 30 years ahead because voters don't reward you for doing that. So the only way that this happens is if the security of the nation is more important to that government than a short-term viewpoint. And that is something that it's really difficult to ask of governments.
Now, it should also be pointed out that some of these problems stem from the Navy itself, where on some occasions the Navy has opted for what's best for it, but maybe not what's best for the budget, where the Navy's proposal for the project is the best and brightest of everything, meaning that these designs are often highly complicated, often prone to failure, and sometimes economically disastrous, with the Navy having also underestimated how much these projects are going to cost. And to give an example of just how much these estimates can differ by, if we take a look at, let's say, the new medium landing ship that was proposed by the Navy, the LSM, well, the Navy's estimates have it pegged at a cost of around $150 million per ship. But when those plans then went through an independent assessment under the Congressional Budget Office, their estimates came back significantly higher, with the CBO's estimates being that these ships would cost somewhere between $340 and $439 million per ship, which, to put into perspective, means that across a proposed 30 ships, the difference between the Navy's estimates and the CBO's estimates are somewhere around $8.4 billion, which is not only a pretty big margin of error, but also might reveal some hints as to why some of these costs blow out. So can you take us through why there are these massive discrepancies between the estimating figures?
It's actually really difficult to estimate the cost of a ship, which does seem odd because it is a specific thing. There are materials that go in and a ship comes out. But there are a lot of things that you have to think about when it comes to ship design and so on that actually really do wildly vary the cost. So, for example, when you're building a new class of ship, the first one in that class is always going to cost more because that's where you work out the little snags in construction, in design, and so on. So the first ship will always cost more than ship number 3, which will always cost more than ship number 5, and so on, because as the facilities get used to building them, the cost will come down per unit. So if you are building a new class of ship, but you're only going to build 3 of them, say like the Zumwalt class, each of those ships is going to be a lot more expensive per unit than if you're building 25 ships or 50 ships. There's also problems when it comes to ship design, not only from the contractor standpoint, but from the Navy standpoint. So there may be things that the Navy hadn't quite planned out properly, and then it gets to the construction side and it turns out there's a problem. So the contractor has to go back to the Navy and say, hey, we've got to this point, this doesn't work, we need to fix this, it will cost a bit more to figure out the answer to that and then put that into the design. So that's why the first in class tends to be more expensive. When you're looking at the cost of a warship, do you look at the cost of the first in class? Do you look at the cost of all, say, 25 of them and average that out over each ship? It's very hard to estimate what a ship will cost and what it actually ends up costing.
Now, I think I've picked on Congress long enough, so let's go look at the other side for a bit. Now, it's pretty hard to walk away from the fact that there have been just so many delays and cost overruns across almost all of these projects currently being run by the shipyards. Now, if you ask them the reasons, a lot of them are going to point to things like COVID and supply chain problems. But how truthful do you think that statement is? Have all of these problems really only cropped up over the last few years?
Given how the shipbuilding industry also looked pre-COVID, it's not like we were in a glorious realm of shipbuilding in 2019 and then suddenly COVID came and everything went wrong. These have been structural problems since the 1990s. And to blame everything on a short-term blip to do with COVID or inflation, I think is diminishing the problem. So the problem with asking industry about this is they are going to make it sound like they can do that if they just get the orders, which is partially true, but the wider structural issues are government's problem. And it's the problem that government needs to think about solving and to do that quickly. And relying on contractors to take the entire brunt of the blame for this, I think, is unfair as well.
Okay, now to play the other side for a moment here. If we were to, let's say, take away Congress's ability to oversee and intervene in these projects, there is a real risk that some of these defense companies will run completely unchecked. As in the past, we've seen multiple occasions where the US government has listened to these defense companies and provided significant funding so they can upgrade their facilities, strengthen their production capabilities, and prepare a better workforce. And once that money hits private hands, instead of reinvesting that money into this or expanding the workforce, in the past, some of those companies have instead chosen to direct those funds towards executive bonuses or stock buybacks to artificially inflate their share price. Which, as an example, in 2022, the same year when a lot of these defense contractors were crying poor and demanding government assistance in order to upgrade their facilities and better prepare their supply chains, several US defense contractors would at the same time spend $19 billion on stock buybacks, vastly pushing up the price of the shares owned by the company, with some of these companies even spending twice as much on stock buybacks that they did on research and development. And this highlights a bit of a problem, that these are private companies. And so once that money hits the bank account, it's much harder to govern how they'll use that money. So how do you remove that profit incentive from this transaction? How do you prevent these guys from just spending the money we give them on stock buybacks or bonuses? What is the best model to try and prevent what we have going on at the moment? Should we be looking at some sort of incremental reform, or should we be looking at a major overhaul, possibly even looking back towards something like public shipyards, like we used to do back in the day?
I actually would think about it not through the lens of the way it is now, but through the lens of industrial policy, because ultimately shipyards and their supplier bases are very economically good for the US. Building a lot of ships and in different places gives you an economic boost in those communities, more jobs, and that concatenates down the supplier chain. So every single part, system, etc., all the way down, that all creates economic prosperity. And that, I think, is the way that it's not often thought about in that way in the US. I don't know if that's because it sounds too left-wing, too much like Labour Union policy, but thinking about it in that sense of investment in shipbuilding to incentivize investment from private companies, to create clusters where those facilities can be built and can all kind of play off each other, which then creates prosperity in those communities. I think thinking about it in that kind of holistic way, and not just the naval side, the specifically military side, but also the commercial side and the civilian side, because the US should also be building oil rigs and fishing vessels and patrol vehicles and barges and tugs and every other single type of ship you can think of. Having a healthy naval shipbuilding industry will also help the maritime shipbuilding industry as a whole. So thinking about everything holistically and having an industrial policy for it, I think, is the only way to deal with it.
So it's pretty clear where many of these issues are coming from. On one side, you have members of Congress prioritizing short-term gains, and on the other side, you have defense companies prioritizing short-term profits, which is exactly what you'd expect both sides to economically do. So are other countries also facing these same issues within their shipbuilding industries? Well, to help us answer that, we turn to our third guest.
Part 3. The Shift to Shanghai.
So when you look at the growth that we've seen in Chinese shipbuilding, there's really a couple different factors that come into play. The first is they've taken a strategic approach to looking at the industry.
Matthew Funiole is the Vice President of the Ideas Lab and a Senior Fellow at the China Power Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, with his specialization being in Chinese foreign policy around dual-use technology, with particular focus on the Chinese shipbuilding and maritime trade. So, we're thrilled to have him on the program today.
So for a lot of countries, right, they put up pretty stringent blocks between the military and the commercial side of things. And this is more indicative of democracies, right? It's how democracies operate. They want to attract foreign capital, and they know attracting foreign capital, they want to make sure there's clear lines of demarcation between the commercial side and the military side. But then there's also security implications, right? If you're working on some of your most sensitive naval assets, you don't necessarily want there to be potential leakage through the commercial side or having personnel around that doesn't really need to be there. What I would say is that despite all of that, right, and how other countries might worry about things like sensitive technology, China has clearly found ways of mitigating these risks, and it has not stopped them really in any way from co-locating production. And so you have military and commercial overlap both with the assets and probably with some of the personnel as well. And whatever security concerns come from that, they certainly either have mitigated them or don't think that they pose such a risk as to overshadow the benefits of having those two different veins of production co-located.
So when we start comparing the US and Chinese shipbuilding industries, the two are so incredibly different. Where what we find is that in the US, almost all new production has moved toward the private sector. Subsidies have been cut or significantly reduced, and private shipbuilding is now spread across states like Mississippi, California, Wisconsin, Virginia, and Pennsylvania, with almost all of these US facilities being almost entirely focused on building military vessels under contract with the US Navy, with the US now having very little involvement in the civilian market. Whereas by contrast, the approach in China has been entirely different, with the Chinese shipbuilding industry concentrated mostly around major maritime hubs like Shanghai and Dalian, the industry being heavily subsidized and supported by the Chinese state, and it's really not uncommon to see civilian commercial ships being built right alongside military vessels like destroyers, frigates, or amphibious assault ships. In China, these industries are much more commingled. So why is there this stark difference between the two sides?
Right. When you think about China, you think about it being the engine of the global economy, and a lot of that capacity gets put into large manufacturing, especially shipbuilding. There's been decades of investments and subsidies in China, right? And on the flip side, you have divestment from the shipbuilding industry on the US side. There's just differences in labor costs, but also the availability of talent, right? China has some of the leading universities in the world, especially when it comes to some of the fields, STEM fields, especially in engineering, marine engineering. And that's helping to give them a pretty steady pipeline. And I'd say the last factor that's really helped to build up Chinese capabilities is just indirect support from other parts of the Chinese economy. Things like steel. China's a huge steel producer. Steel plates are around 25% of all shipbuilding costs, and China can subsidize those internally within its own market. Shipbuilding is one of those industries where the margins for profit are pretty thin, right? And so all of the major shipbuilders have at one point or another injected money into the industry through subsidies. So China's done it, Japan's done it, Korea's done it. The US used to do it when it was still something of a shipbuilder. It's just sort of a necessary component to it. But for China, there's some really interesting stuff that has been happening. It's trying to, as much as possible, merge the commercial and the military side of shipbuilding in the country. And that gives it a number of pretty significant advantages. I mean, there's certainly the technology overlap there, but from just a pure economics standpoint, if the market is down and they're trying to keep capacity up, they can always turn towards the military shipbuilding side of things. And so there's this symbiotic relationship in Chinese shipyards between the military aspect of it and the commercial aspect of it. It allows China to sort of flip between that capacity, right? Okay, well, we're going to work on fulfilling these orders that we have on the order books. Those are filled up. Well, now let's get back to our military modernization. And we kind of see some of the key shipyards sort of playing both hats, depending on what's going on with the global economy.
And these commercial ships that China's building, are they being built for Chinese companies or are they being built for foreign owners as well?
There's the domestic commercial side. China's one of the biggest shipbuilders in the world, but it's also one of the biggest shipping countries in the world, right? Just in terms of its companies shipping goods around the globe. And then there's foreign order. China builds a lot of ships, and some of those ships are for its own shipping companies, but a lot of them are also for foreign clients as well. So it's producing ships for European, for other Asian countries, for their shipping industries as well. And so you have a huge, huge influx of commercial capital, a good portion of that being foreign capital that helps to, in one way or the other, offset some of the costs for the military modernization.
One of the largest shipbuilders we're discussing here would be CSSC, which produces a vast amount of ships each year for the Chinese government, both in the commercial and military sectors. Now, recently, they also signed a major deal with the French giant CMA-CGM to build a whole bunch of very high-capacity vessels for the European market, signaling that China is only going to become a bigger player within this industry. Now, if we compare something like CSSC to a US company like HII, in HII, the US government has fairly limited say on how HII runs their day-to-day operations. with most of the business decisions, workforce management, production timelines being largely left to the company to decide how to run things. How much influence does the Chinese government have in the day-to-day running of CSSC as compared to, let's say, how much the American government has over HII's running?
A lot. I mean, CSSC is state controlled, and that means that if there is certain initiatives, certain objectives that the party leadership is trying to execute, then CSSC don't really have a choice there. And so it's closely overseen by the state council. It's very closely tied to the military. Its future has been tied to how the Chinese leaders think about the industry. We see a lot of CSSC shipyards growing and expanding to meet capacity, but they're also getting, subsidies from the government. Drawbacks here, because it all sounds positive from the Chinese perspective, is that they still struggle with this issue of corruption, which is pretty rampant in a lot of different parts of the Chinese economy, although definitely been cracked down on in the last few years. But former officials in the defense industry are in prison or are being investigated for corruption, and that includes the former chairman of CSSC. That notwithstanding, you still have this tremendous amount of market share. So we talk about China controlling around 50% of all commercial shipbuilding. Probably half of that 50% is CSSC. And a lot of the dual-use shipyards that we look at in our research are CSSC shipyards.
So in the last section, we talked a bit about how Congress in the United States can intervene into the shipbuilding process and even overrule what the Department of Defense or the Navy might be recommending or even requesting. Do we see that same kind of intervention and influence happening in China as well, where civilian politicians can directly intervene and decide what kind of projects get built?
Well, there's certainly less conflicting interest. In the U.S., there are, converging interests between what the U.S. Navy needs, what politicians want, what local politicians want, what the executive branch wants, what the legislative branch wants, right? So you have all the beautiful mess that is democracy, which can slow down production of any type of sensitive military asset, especially ones at the price point that we're kind of talking about here. China, there's less so of that. If you look at what Xi Jinping has done, I think been very effective at getting everyone in line with what the strategic vision is. That's coming from Xi directly, right? By the middle of the century, we're going to have a blue water navy. And a blue water navy means you can sail your navy pretty much anywhere in the world. But on the technological component of it, or on what you need in order for that to happen, there may be some debate, right? Oh, we need 6 carrier groups. We need 8 carrier groups, right? And that's stuff that internal dynamics that we don't have access to. So we don't know entirely what's determining that. But we do know is that if you're getting that kind of directive from the leadership that we're going to become a Navy that has aircraft carriers, China's going to start building aircraft carriers. And the debate really is going to come down to, are we going to build them at Jiangnan or are we going to build them at Dalian? Because that's the 2 places where we know we can build them.
So I think let's take a moment and get a clearer picture of where China stands at the moment, and in turn, what the US is up against. Because as of 2023, the US naval forces tend to launch around 1 to 5 ships annually, whilst the Chinese naval forces tend to launch somewhere around 20 to 35 vessels annually, which is a pretty staggering difference. And at present, China operates somewhere around 234 naval combatants, with over 90 of those having been built in the years just between 2015 and 2019. But before everyone starts freaking out, these numbers don't tell the full story, as there are still a few US categories that Washington tends to lead on. The most obvious one being aircraft carriers, as right now the US has 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers currently in operation, whereas the Chinese only have 2 to 3, depending on who you want to ask. And whilst the US is putting most of their priorities on aircraft carriers and high-end submarines, China tends to put more of their focus on frigates, destroyers, and amphibious assault ships. Ships that are usually much cheaper to produce and much quicker to produce as well. Those numbers, though, do tell a story. So what lessons do you think we can take away from the Chinese shipbuilding industry at the moment?
Yeah, China only has 3-ish carriers, depends on how we count the first one. Do we count 2.5? Whatever we want to say about the layouting. And now they're sort of putting the finishing touches on their 3rd one, and that's pretty quick development in a short amount of time. The example I think is most interesting here is when you actually look at the catapult system, so the launch system for the aircraft on the aircraft carriers. First 2 have the old style, that very distinctive ramp on the front of it, the ski jump style that you see on older technology to try to create some additional lift. But what they really wanted to do for the 3rd carrier is have a modern, I'm using air quotes, you can't see me, but a modern aircraft carrier. And that means having some type of catapult system, right? Some sort of assist for launching aircraft so you can have them carrying more weight when they're taking off. And they skipped steam. Most of the US carrier fleet uses steam for its catapult system. Our newer sort of aircraft carriers, the Gerald Ford class, they use EMALS, electromagnetic system for launching, which has a lot of benefits. It's very new technology. So China didn't try to copy what the US has done. Say, okay, we'll do steam, we'll figure out steam, and then we'll jump to our EMALS style technology. They just went straight to the latest and greatest. And there are certainly risks that come with that, but that's pretty impressive. And they're the only other country in the world that uses that type of catapult launch system. And at that point, that's all in a 20-year period, going from nothing to having a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier with an advanced catapult system on it. That's pretty quick.
What about consistency-wise? If China were to, let's say, order a whole bunch of ships, how likely is it that that order would be completed as scheduled?
You're less likely to see an instance in China where all of a sudden a production block is canceled, right? What you actually see is a lot of blocks being ordered after one another. So you can see, we're going to order our first block of Type 75s. There's 3 of those. Okay, those are successful. Let's order a second block of those. And let's also at the same time start building the Type 76, which is a more advanced version of an amphibious assault ship. And let's build them all at the same time. So there's probably been an instance of one class here or there where China initially ordered X amount and they decided to cut production early on it, but I don't know an instance off the top of my head. So you have a lot of consistency.
And this brings us to one of the biggest debates that analysts have surrounding the Chinese Navy, with the question being quantity versus quality. Well, on one side, the more China-friendly proponents will point to the sheer number of ships being built and point to it as a sign of where China is outpacing the United States. However, those on the US side might point out that yes, China does have more hulls and it definitely puts more ships into the ocean each year. The vessels it does are less technologically advanced than what the US Navy is running with a key statistic that's often being cited in this one being the number of vertical launch systems both fleets have available to them. As while, yes, the Chinese Navy is larger than the US Navy by numbers, the Chinese PLAN only currently operates around 4,200 VLS cells across the entire fleet. Whereas if we look at the US fleet, despite having a smaller number, well, they operate 9,900 VLS cells, giving them a pretty significant firepower advantage and a qualitative edge if the two sides were to fight. And moreover, proponents on the US side are also going to point out that it's not just about firepower either, but about who can better leverage the technological advancements for maximum efficiency. For instance, which would be more beneficial, to simply just have another bunch of VLS systems strapped to another boat that goes into the water, that you then have to crew, maintain, and pay for the whole time, or building a subsequent system that can reload those VLS systems far faster and far more efficiently, which meaning you can use the ships they currently have to far greater extent. Now, I know with you having followed this debate for a very long time, you've probably heard this quantity versus quality debate all the time. So I want to get your idea on this one. Can the US ignore the Chinese having such a large fleet because it does still have the technological advantage?
I'd say that there is some logic to that, especially historical logic to that, but it's changing and it's risky to continue to think along those lines without some caveats. So yeah, China's got a big fleet, right? It's got a bigger fleet than the United States. It's growing towards, 430 some odd ships by 2040, I think is the estimate that I've seen. A lot of those vessels today are less sophisticated vessels than what the US has. That doesn't mean they can't complete their mission set, right? Because keep in mind that a lot of what the mission set looks like for China is regional defense or littoral defense, where the US has a much more expansive mission set. So yes, there is definitely a technological trade-off in some of those vessels. But we've seen China move pretty quickly in upscaling some of its technology in the last, say, decade or so. You look at things like the Type 55, for instance. I mean, that's a pretty advanced vessel that you're looking at. Are they as good as the US version? No. But they can produce a lot more of them. They can produce them more quickly. And they're going to be more focused in one theater of operations. But I think it's risky to kind of look at it and say, Chinese vessels aren't very good. They're getting better.
On top of that, there is another factor here that will be significantly impacting China's naval development going forward. Now, if you remember from earlier on in the episode when we discussed China's Navy, we talked about how over 90 of the vessels they currently have in use went into service between 2015 and 2019, with many more being built just before that period. And while this was a remarkable surge in the naval capacity, for China it also presents a bit of a challenge for the shipbuilding industry, as many of those ships commissioned during this period, or just before, are now reaching the point in their life cycle where they require extensive repairs and overhauls. This being a fairly natural but quite costly aspect of maintaining a modern fleet. Now for the PLAN, the People's Liberation Army Navy, this creates a few converging pressures. as they have to not only ramp up the amount of facilities that can do these repairs, because so many ships are going to require these facilities at once, they also have to deal with the added challenges of rising labor costs, which in China have nearly doubled over that decade. They have to deal with the fact that a lot of these materials have become more expensive over time, as well as the fact that other parts of the government, most of your economic advisors, are going to be pushing Chinese leadership towards focusing on the civilian construction sector, considering how much money it's bringing in for the country at the moment. And when you start to think about all this, the cost of repairing and maintaining all of these ships over the next few years is going to consume larger and larger portions of the PLAN's budget. So parts of the budget that would usually be dedicated to building new ships now needs to start to be reallocated towards repairing the ships they have. Again, a fairly natural point in the life cycle of a ship. Now, looking at some of the figures that are coming out of China, we are seeing that the civilian sector of shipbuilding is gaining momentum and speed, particularly with more European companies signing contracts with the Chinese. But we are also seeing that the military side of shipbuilding is starting to slow down, whether it be just due to a lack of facilities, a bottleneck in the shipbuilders, or just that the capital just isn't there at the moment. So from the numbers you're seeing and looking at here as well, and putting aside the civilian construction sector, are you also seeing this slight drop in the amount of military ships being commissioned? That without a massive boom in the Chinese economy, they will still be producing a lot of ships, but just probably not at the pace they were before.
We've already kind of seen them slow down a little bit. Once you build a ship, that's great. But once it goes into the water and once it actually starts being in service and being used to complete missions, it takes a lot of wear and tear. And I've seen estimates, this is back of the envelope estimates, where it costs about 4 times the cost to actually produce the ship to maintain it over the course of its lifetime. And if that's the case, quickly building all these different vessels is going to, at some point, have to turn some of this capacity into repair. They're still putting a lot of ships out, but they're not putting out quite at the same pace as they say were, 2015 to 2019, tons and tons of ships getting produced. They're still making a lot, but I think you're starting to see that production slow down since around 2020. And part of that is that they have fulfilled some of the immediate needs. And second, they're working on some of their more advanced platforms now. And that's going to take some time to develop, sort of tweaking designs as they go for some of these more advanced platforms.
China and the US are both facing completely different sets of problems within their shipbuilding industry. Where for China, we have a situation where the PLAN's expenses are growing at a much faster rate than the military budget is, and more of the decision makers have their eyes locked on the profit-making part of the business. Whereas in the US, we find the shipbuilding industry faces an entirely different set of problems, with a lack of funding, lack of oversight, with the DoD, the Navy, Congress, and all the shipbuilders all having vastly different priorities and different strategies for getting around all this. So how does this dynamic play out long term? What's being done to address some of these issues? And what happens if we find ourselves at war in the near future? Well, to answer that, we turn to our final guest.
Part 4. Captured Capital.
So the commercial shipbuilding comparison is pretty easy. Basically, China is by far the world's largest shipbuilder, is the largest shipbuilder in the history of humanity, and the U.S. commercial shipbuilding industry is essentially non-existent.
Thomas Shugart is an adjunct senior fellow with the Defense Program at the Center for New American Security, whose research focuses on undersea warfare and maritime competition within the Indo-Pacific. Shugart has spent more than 25 years serving with the US Navy, where he last worked in the Defense Department's Office of Net Assessment. Following his submarine command tour, he also served on the Navy's staff as the principal officer providing oversight for the Columbia-class ballistic missile submarine program, as well as serving as a senior advisor for Defense Department officials on nuclear weapons employment plans. Tom's work on this subject has been published in numerous publications, and so we're thrilled to have him on the program today.
Well, in terms of prioritization, I think there's a couple different ways you can look at it. If you're looking at it from the shipyard's perspective, most of the shipyards that we look at on the U.S. side build one type of vessel or another. There's one exception in that Newport News Shipbuilding builds both nuclear submarine modules and also nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. But most of the rest of them are building one kind of ship. They're building destroyers, or they're building amphibious assault ships, or they are building submarines, like in the case of Electric Boat in Groton, the U.S.'s largest submarine shipyard. That's all they do is build nuclear submarines. So it's not really up to the shipyards for the most part themselves to prioritize what they're going to do. It's whatever contracts they get from the government. The prioritization occurs within the U.S. defense budget in terms of what does the Navy want to buy? What is the Department of Defense's leadership above the Navy? What does it want them to buy? Which has been a point of quite a bit of contention in recent years. And then ultimately, what does Congress want the Navy to buy? Because they've certainly in many cases added in additional hulls to procure after the budget has been submitted in most cases. And at this point, the lion's share of the shipbuilding resources are mostly going to submarines. The U.S. is entering in terms of a tonnage basis, a period of its largest submarine construction since the Cold War. So really quite an extraordinary amount of resources going into the submarine shipbuilding effort in the years to come.
So out of all the projects the Navy has going at the moment, its highest priority has been on its new submarines, particularly the new Columbia-class ballistic missile submarines, as these submarines are designed to replace the aging Ohio-class and form a pretty critical component of the US nuclear deterrent. Now, the Columbia-class was designated as the Navy's top acquisition priority as early as 2013, meaning that the Columbia-class got the best of everything. The other projects could be cannibalized in order to keep the Columbia-class program on schedule. And yet, right now, even with all that support, it seems that the Columbia-class is still currently running around 6 to 12 months behind schedule, with some in the Navy having significant concerns, as if there are any further delays in the program, they could miss a number of critical deployment deadlines. Now, to avoid this, the Navy has been cannibalizing even more from other programs, trying to get the Columbia-class back on track, but by doing so has caused problems in other parts of the shipbuilding industry, particularly for the other class of submarine currently in construction, the Virginia-class attack submarines, which are both essential for intelligence gathering, anti-ship operations, and special operations support. Currently, the Virginia-class submarines as a whole are running about 36 months behind schedule, with Block 5, the one that introduces the Virginia payload module, being about 24 months behind schedule. And at the moment for the Virginia-class, that rate seems to only be getting worse. So my question is, how are these priorities decided? Who determines that it should be the Columbia-class that gets the highest amount of funding and resources? Is it Congress, the Navy, the Department of Defense? Who has control of the purse strings here to make that decision?
Ultimately, it's the U.S. Congress which controls the purse strings and the authorization in terms of the hulls and then the funds that are appropriated to actually make those hulls be purchased. So ultimately, it's up to Congress. Obviously, there's a lot of different influences on Congress in terms of their constituents, industry, what the public wants, recommendations from the Navy, from DOD. I mean, you have to remember that DOD and the Navy are not necessarily the same thing. You have on the one hand what the Navy leadership might really want, and then there's what the Department of Defense leadership ultimately approves after analysis by the CAPE, which is a fairly powerfully influential organization, CAPE standing for Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation. So that's a cross-service organization that kind of the bean counters that look at different options for military capability and how efficient or effective they might be from a cost perspective. And then you have ultimately the White House and its Office of Management and Budget, which provided some of the limitations for the amount of funding that's required. So in many cases, DOD is not necessarily going to recommend what the Navy wants. So you may have the Navy to some degree influencing Congress, either through unfunded priority lists or, I'm not going to say side efforts, but there's different ways that desires can be got across. So if you look at the Chinese shipbuilding industry, what we have to remember is that essentially all of the companies involved are, at least all the big ones, are state-owned enterprises. So they are at least partly owned by the Chinese state, in many cases in fairly opaque ways. So there's a great deal of direct state involvement in the companies, which is very different than the U.S. naval shipbuilders, which are private companies. Then you have to remember the involvement of the Chinese Communist Party. So the Chinese Communist Party is not the Chinese state. They're different, but obviously the Chinese state does what the party says, since it's the only political party there is. And if you look at the leadership cadres of these shipbuilders, they are all Communist Party members. So one thing that I've found quite amusing sometimes to look at is to look at the websites of Chinese state-owned enterprises, because on the one hand, you can look at the English version of their websites that they present to the Western world, which a lot of them just look like regular companies. They talk about the things they're doing for their customers. And if you look at the organizational structure, it looks like a regular company. So they've got chairman, vice chairman, board of directors, et cetera. It just looks like a regular company. In many cases, you can then also go look at the Chinese language version of their websites and then translate it. And in many cases, those Chinese language websites are very different. They'll have entire portions of the website that are devoted to the Communist Party and Xi Jinping thought, and the news stories that the companies talk about, in many cases talk about party events. And if you look at the organizational structure, you can see quite clearly that the leadership is essentially all dual-hatted as chairman and party secretary, vice chairman and deputy party secretary, et cetera, the way down. And so you can see quite clearly there that these organizations are arms of the Communist Party to at least some degree. So that's another way that state, or if not state, at least the government leadership influence very much makes its way to those companies.
Now, we do cover this in a lot more detail on our episode focusing on the Russian Navy, but historically, the dynamic has usually been that whilst the Russian surface fleet has had somewhat questionable quality, when it comes to submarines, the Russians have usually been somewhere either just below or just above where the US is, although that does also differ between categories. However, in recent years, China appears to have made some pretty significant strides and is closing the gap pretty quickly. Now, the allegations being that much of this progress China's been making has been thanks to either stealing, buying, or reverse engineering Russian designs. With, as an example, the Type 93 Shang class and the Type 94 Jin class bearing pretty noticeable similarities to the Russian equivalents. Yet in the recent designs, China has demonstrated some growing capacity, particularly when it comes to the Type 95 and the Type 96. So I want to get your feeling on this. How much have the Chinese designs progressed in recent times?
So that question of what is the origin of Chinese naval designs has really changed quite dramatically over the years. In the decades past, you had Chinese designs that were, if not derivatives, at least either complete copies or directly purchased from the Soviet Union and then Russia. They purchased Kilo submarines from the Russians. They purchased Sovremeny class destroyers from the Russians, although those have been significantly modified in recent years and quite significantly upgraded with the Chinese equipment that the Russians don't even have. So definitely very heavy, if derivative, if not outright purchased designs from Russia. That has all changed. So if you look at the most recent ships that are coming off the ways in China, the Type 55 cruiser, the Type 54A, and then now the Type 54B frigate, the Type 76, or Type 75 amphibious assault ship. Those ships are derivative of nobody. They are unique Chinese designs. And in some cases, especially in recent years, the Chinese have advanced beyond anything that the U.S. Navy is building, and it's been quite innovative. They, for example, have the new Type 76 amphibious assault ship that is under construction as we speak in Shanghai. That is an amphibious assault ship that also has an aircraft catapult on board. And there's no U.S. platform that looks like that or anywhere else on the planet that looks quite like that.
Now, another key aspect of this discussion is the export market, as selling naval ships can provide additional revenue to your shipyards and create some long-term demand and cooperation between the two navies. However, the United States has pretty limited naval exports at the moment, particularly when it comes to larger vessels. And for example here, one of the few recent large ship orders the US has been involved with, currently in progress, is tied up with Australia, as part of the 2021 AUKUS agreement. Now, as a part of this deal, Australia signed on to purchase nuclear-powered Virginia-class attack submarines from the United States, which is a massive jump up in technology for the Australian Navy, whose current submarine fleet is primarily made up of aging Collins-class units. But whilst the introduction of the Virginia-class into the Australian Navy does represent a massive jump up, it hasn't been without its controversial logistical hurdles. As under the 2021 AUKUS agreement, the agreement initially projected delivery of the first Virginia-class submarines to Australia somewhere between 2028 and 2031. However, when those projections were made, the US was producing approximately 2 Virginia-class submarines per year. And so some US lawmakers got involved and started questioning whether selling these submarines would leave the US with enough submarines to fulfill its own requirements. And from there, US Navy policymakers stated the production of Virginia submarines would need to rise to 2.33 submarines annually in order to accommodate the exports Australia bought and the requirements the US Navy has. Now, when that statement was made, the US was producing 2 submarines per year. But since then, the production of Virginia-class submarines has actually gone down, with the US now only producing around 1.3 submarines annually, with the latest projections stating that they don't think they'll return to anywhere near 2 submarines, still not enough to fulfill the Australian needs, till at least 2028, which in real terms means Australia probably won't receive its first Virginia submarine until at least the early 2030s. forcing Australia to spend a lot of money keeping its Collins class going, and creating significant capability gaps in Australia's defensive capabilities. However, that's a whole story for a whole other time. Today, we're mostly just focusing on the Americans. And where I want to compare here is starting to look at the Chinese export market, because whilst the Americans are exporting very little of these large ships, China's exports seem to be increasing, both in the civilian and military markets. As an example, to Pakistan, China has already sold multiple Yuan-class submarines. To Bangladesh, they've sold a number of Type 35 Ming-class submarines. To Thailand, they've already sold some Type S-26T submarines, although admittedly those did come with problems with the engine. And even Algeria has bought some Type 41 submarines from them. Now, with the US struggling to meet these production goals, and China expanding its footprint in the export market, do you think this imbalance in the export market is only likely to increase in China's favor going forward?
So there's been a significant number of nations, in some cases outright Chinese treaty allies, in other cases countries that were thought to be a little more on the fence, increasingly seem to be buying Chinese hardware, which shouldn't surprise us. Chinese shipyards are the biggest shipyards on the planet, and in some cases probably some of the most advanced shipyards on the planet. So for customers out there that are kind of non-aligned nations, it shouldn't surprise us that they may decide that their best bang for the buck is to buy Chinese.
Given the increasingly discussed scenario of, let's say, a conflict with China, modeling something similar to the latest DoD white papers, in other words, a rapid campaign to try and seize the main island, potentially somewhere around 2027, 2028, what position does the United States currently find itself in to counter such an operation? Should such a conflict occur, how well prepared are the US to manage both the war itself and the post-war recovery? Considering whilst both sides envision it to be quite a quick campaign, they do envision larger losses on both sides as well. What are some of the timelines and concerns we could expect here?
That's honestly one of the things that worries me the most about the military balance between the US and China. If you look, for example, at World War II, Japan tried to carry out a surprise attack against the United States and destroyed or damaged a number of US capital ships in Pearl Harbor, and then overwhelmed other forward deployed ships that were in the Western Pacific. But quite frankly, none of that really mattered because the United States had started a emergency shipbuilding program in the years before World War II. I worry really that the shoe is on the other foot now, that China very much has a robust shipbuilding program that's ongoing, that by my estimates and my calculations on a tonnage basis is outbuilding the US by about 50% over the last decade or so. And then behind that is that massive shipbuilding industry. When you combine that with the fact that it's quite possible that China could also strike by surprise somewhat in the manner that Japan did. And we see this in Chinese doctrine. It doesn't just talk about strike by surprise, it is obsessed with striking by surprise, particularly against what it calls the powerful enemy, which is a euphemism for the United States. And then they have gone and put massive resources into building the kind of military force that you would use to do that, with 500 intermediate range ballistic missiles that can range out to Guam and all across the Western Pacific, and 1,000 medium range ballistic missiles that can hit all over Japan. The one that executes the surprise attack is the one with the larger shipbuilding program, which is not a great place for us to be in. So we could already be within the window of strategic surprise with respect to Chinese capacity to invade Taiwan, in the sense that if China really turned on the military shipbuilding, that is, which nation could deal better with battle damage from combat and replacing losses? The U.S. defense industrial base is struggling mightily right now just to build and maintain the ships that it has now in peacetime. And with the peacetime building rate, I really worry about our ability to repair losses, to repair or replace losses in combat, particularly given the U.S.'s relative paucity of salvage vessels, of fleet tugs to be able to tow away ships that have been damaged.
So this issue here is what many analysts point to as the main reason why China puts such large subsidies into its domestic shipbuilding industry. That even if there were a downturn in the civilian market, Beijing would go out of its way to ensure that its shipyards remain fully operational, maintaining production at near maximum capacity. Now, do you think the strategic investment is solely aimed at just dominating the global commercial market and undercutting international competitors in that field? Or do you feel this is part of a broader strategy to make sure they can maintain a robust industrial base, capable of carrying out rapid transitioning to military shipbuilding if required?
Well, I think, as is probably true with almost anything in China, there's probably a lot of reasons involved, and many of them are fairly opaque. That being said, I do think there is a deliberate strategic purpose. China is well aware that it's the largest trading nation in the world, that its economy is dependent both exports of what it builds and also for imports of raw materials and energy. So if you're going to build that Navy, well, one of the efficient ways to do it is to have shipyards that are subsidized, in many cases, by the West. It never ceases to amaze me that, for example, a couple of years ago, we had China's first fully homegrown, home-designed aircraft carrier being built in a Chinese shipyard, literally right next to a container ship being built for a Taiwanese company. So you have a carrier named after the province from which China, Fujian, the province from which China routinely threatens to invade Taiwan, being built in a shipyard subsidized by Western companies, including Taiwan. So why not set up a paradigm like that where you've got this subsidized workforce, it's available to help out with the naval shipbuilding to build the Navy you need to both project power across the Taiwan Strait and potentially eventually further afield, and also to protect your sea lines of communication. Why not go ahead and do that? It makes sense to me. In contrast, the U.S. naval shipbuilding isn't particularly competitive. I mean, there are brief competitions for contracts at the beginning of a program, like, for example, with the frigate program, multiple different shipyards putting in proposals. But once those designs are chosen and once those programs are begun, there's not really much competition there. So it's a relatively non-competitive industry, as opposed to China shipyards, which compete with each other, but also are on every single day are competing for commercial business around the world, which I imagine brings them efficiencies they have to be able to build competitive ships in a commercial industry that I'm sure translate very directly to greater efficiency in their building of naval vessels, using a lot of the same processes, the same people, and the same capital equipment. And another thing that points to continued pretty strong production is the fact they've expanded their shipyards in recent years. They just finished expanding facilities at the Hudong Zhonghua shipyard next to the Jiangnan shipyard in Shanghai. Brand new shipyard, they're still building it. Also, major recent expansions in the last few years to the Bohai nuclear submarine shipyard, big expansion to the Wuchang shipyard in Wuhan.
Which I suppose brings us to our final question here, and one that I feel we've kind of been steadily building towards throughout this episode. As whilst within, let's say, the aviation sector in the US, many of those defense companies, like the ones behind the F-35, are not only massive exporters of that product to other militaries, guaranteeing more production, but also have very large civilian sectors they can rely on to pump capital into the company, with companies like Boeing producing aircraft for air fleets all around the world. However, when it comes to this industry, the shipbuilding industry, the US companies seem to operate under a very different paradigm, one where these ships are incredibly complex, whilst in the civilian market, these ships would be undercut by cheap Chinese ships hitting the market. And for these US shipbuilders, not only is the sheer cost of capital acquisition problematic, but there is almost a near certainty of cost overruns. Almost all of these US ships are highly complex and require a very complex security environment. The US tends to make much smaller runs of each ship, which is going to push up the cost per unit of each of these ships. And above all of that is a much higher risk of contract cancellations. So where we have this niche nature of an industry, where we created an environment where the private industry is struggling to sustain itself without the government having to throw more money after more money just to keep it afloat, it'd be pretty easy to argue that at least something needs to change. So for these very advanced ships that the US is hoping to build, in your opinion, can we realistically rely on the private industry alone to meet the demands that the US industry has? And if not, should the US consider a shift back to either the pre-Reagan policies of significant federal subsidies going toward these companies in order to make them competitive and give them a civilian market edge? Or even possibly going even further than that and looking toward the pre-World War II model of nationalizing these shipyards under direct government control, as by bringing these facilities under direct control, one could argue that these ships could serve as things like a direct job program or training program, but would likely also allow the government more oversight into how the money given to the shipyards is spent. Whilst for the shipyards, it would reduce contractual uncertainty and allow for a more longer-term approach to the naval procurement process. So in your view, is either the return to the pre-Reagan subsidies or otherwise going further with the nationalization of this industry the logical path forward for ensuring the US has the strategic capability it needs to actually get themselves out of this problem?
Well, I mean, the U.S. isn't China, so I don't think we'd want to apply exactly the same model. And certainly you can have subsidies that go to private yards. We can have our cake and eat it too in that respect. Like we can use private industry, but also have it be government subsidized. That was the case in the past. I mean, so the U.S. shipbuilding industry kind of atrophied for most of the Cold War era. But then when it went from being very small to essentially non-existent now was in the decades after the subsidies that did exist were removed during the Reagan administration. So I think a forward thing to start with, at least, is to bring back those subsidies. I mean, I get it that there are people that, and trust me, I'm a capitalist, pro-free markets guy, but there are some industries that are strategic and that for a reason we need to be willing to subsidize because it's important that we're able to build those things here. There used to be government shipyards that built large naval vessels. I mean, some of the most impressive, well-built, quickly produced ships that won World War II, our battleships, our largest carriers, were built in places like the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, like the Brooklyn Navy Yard, that were government facilities. So I know that that's probably not going to be popular on some parts of the political spectrum for reasons that may be valid, but that was how in some cases it was done in the past. We could encourage investment by our allies, by their shipbuilding companies in the U.S., into U.S. shipyards, potentially bringing back some of them, using their capital, their expertise, probably subsidized, probably with a partnership with the U.S. government. But I think that could be useful. We also need to be grown-ups and say, maybe we should build some ships in foreign yards. If we look at the last time we had a challenge of the scale that we're seeing now in the form of Nazi Germany, the U-boat campaign, and also the Imperial Japanese Navy, there was a fairly substantial sharing of naval assets among the allies. So in a case like that, we need to be grown-ups and get past Buy American. There's a lot of options that should be on the table.
Look, I would never doubt the US's capability to fight a war when it's focused, and I have no doubt into the US's enthusiasm to fight once the US has come under attack. But whilst we have seen occasions in the past where the US has been able to ramp up quickly with its artillery shell production or its rocket production, when it comes to naval shipbuilding, well, that's a bit of a different industry. As with naval shipbuilding, what you buy today is actually what you fight with in 10 years' time. The US today finds itself in a situation where there are not only growing maritime threats, but also in a situation where production delays and supply complications are only getting worse, opening up to a situation where without timely investment and reform, these ships currently being deployed may be too small in number and not quite right for what we need. And what I mean by this is that even if the US were to win or stalemate the first battle of the next war, as things stand, the other side has a far better ability to reconstitute its fleet and come back with a decisive advantage. But whilst we've been talking about the issues, there have been a lot of solutions floated on the table, and a lot of people pointing fingers on what needs to be fixed here, many of which have been advocated for by shipyards, the Navy, and policymakers for a very long time now. However, as we can see, each of them comes with unique complications. Now, the one most often posed by all sides, and the one most likely to be put forward, is simply massive financial injections into the industry, which, whilst I agree would help the industry and solve some of these bottlenecks, does also raise concerns about oversight, as with these projects being done by private companies who are often contractually obligated to find the best returns for their shareholders. With the other concern simply being just how much money is actually available for these programs, as not only are the Army and the Air Force also screeching for money at the moment, but the Navy finds itself competing with a number of other programs facing similar financial choke points, or other programs that have had massive overhauls simply just kicked down the road by multiple administrations. The most obvious of which being the $1.5 trillion overhaul of the US nuclear weapons program, where Washington can barely figure out where it's going to get the money to do that, let alone to try and pump a whole bunch of money into the shipbuilding industry as well. So other models need to be looked at. Another one proposed is that the US Navy should simply commit to building ships using finalized designs and promising to make no modifications during the production process. Which, again, sounds great and might actually streamline some of the processes we're facing at the moment. However, does also come with some pretty significant risks that the vessels being produced are going to be technologically outdated by the time they're actually delivered. After all, if you're looking at an 8 to 10 year production line, important sections like the IT infrastructure on the ship is likely going to be pretty outdated by the time it actually gets into the water. So simply sticking to the designs you have may not be the solution everyone's looking for either. One of the other solutions I see proposed consistently by Washington is simply more oversight by the government into the shipbuilding industry, the way the Chinese government has much more direct control over its shipbuilders. And whilst it would probably ensure better allocation of resources at times and prevent things like CEOs using money to simply buy back stock, it's also likely to lead to significant friction between these shipbuilders and the government. As at the end of the day, these shipbuilders still need to make a profit for their shareholders, meaning that the government either has to give this regulation oversight some teeth, meaning there's going to be even less private players willing to get into the industry in the first place, or the government gives the regulator no teeth, and all we've done is simply increase the paperwork involved to produce these ships. If we look at one of the other potential solutions here, and one consistently proposed by the shipbuilders, their complaint are around workforce challenges, that they simply just haven't got the workforce to be able to do this. And whilst, yes, the government is right, there are plenty of welders out there or people being willing to be trained out there. Most of them can make good money in a whole bunch of industries at the moment. And a lot of them are going to be pretty reluctant to relocate themselves and their families to shipbuilding hubs like Mississippi or Wisconsin, with the other issue being long-term contracts. As unlike mine sites or repair shops, who can usually offer longer-term contracts, as well as much more job security, these shipbuilders, who often may not be 100% certain if their contracts may be torn up or how long the program might go for, they're probably pretty unlikely to be offering very long-term contracts to workers as well, thereby further disincentivizing people from moving their families to some of these shipyards. And even on occasions where some of these shipyards have built air conditioning in the warehouses, installed a Chick-fil-A directly there in the shipyard, or even offered $10,000 annual retention bonuses, there is still nowhere near enough workers willing to work at that price in order to meet the demand that the US Navy has. The only other big option that's been put forward is for the US to give up on building this program in America and simply rely more on using its allies and successful shipyards in places like Japan and South Korea to take on some of the capacity the US currently doesn't have. And whilst some of this is already going on, with countries like Australia already beginning to offer basic level assistance with things like replenishment and maintenance for US ships whilst they're in Australian ports, outsourcing more critical parts of the production chain to foreign partners seems to be a deal breaker for a lot of the US. As not only does it introduce significant security risks, but there's also political problems as well. As whilst, yes, one could argue that building the non-sensitive components, or even just the basic shape of the hull, could be done more efficiently in other countries, it also takes away a lot of the jobs that would have been guaranteed by those hulls being built in the United States, with many of those jobs being set up in some of the key districts of the votes needed to get these programs passed. So you're not only killing jobs, but you're also killing congressional support, making it much less likely the US will go down that route if they have the choice. Those are the 5 options that have been put forward so far, but as we can see, each of them comes with direct drawbacks or reasons why they're pretty unlikely to actually pass, with the only option that really does tick all those boxes, either through nationalization or a return to subsidies, being both politically unpalatable, but also probably a pretty large threat to a lot of very powerful players in Washington. In the end though, it should be obvious by now that none of these challenges can be solved piecemeal, that the US right now requires simultaneous action across multiple fronts, with those actions going to have to require bipartisan agreement from Congress, going to have to require industry reforms, and probably require at least some form of renewed subsidies at least. How any of that actually gets done, particularly heading into a new congressional session that sees political infighting, and a new administration who's proposing tax cuts that would likely lower the amount of money available for programs like this. Things definitely need to change. And whilst the best time to have put these programs in was probably a decade ago, the second best is now. Thank you so much for checking out the show this week. This one was obviously a pretty big one to put together, but regardless of that, we hope you enjoyed the episode and have an idea on how much work went into this one. Now, if you are one of those people who did enjoy it, well, then you can find out about the next episode we're about to drop by following all of our links and info on Twitter, Reddit, Blue Sky, Mastodon, Threads, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, and TikTok on the handle @TheRedLinePod. Or if you're keen to follow me on Twitter, I'm on the handle @MikeHilliardOz. Oz is in Australia. This show can only function with the support of our amazing Patreons, who donate a small amount of money each month to help myself and the team keep the show going. And speaking of amazing Patreons, this week I'd like to thank Brody Don, Kevin Martin, Bonnie Acosta, Blake, David Geaton, Alexi M, Caspian C, Emily Fagulin, Jens Nordberg, Haresh Patel, and Petra Mills. This show is only possible with the support of listeners like these guys, and we really cannot thank them enough. So if you feel you could spare a couple of dollars, or you want special access to our full video presentations, including topics like the likely outcomes of a renewed 2024 offensive by Russia into Georgia, or a full briefing on each of the individuals within Putin's inner circle, or even our upcoming live stream, with full maps and timelines for the fall of Assad, where we go through the timeline and tactics used by the various groups to take control of Syria. You can do so by jumping onto our Patreon or using any of the links in the description below. As usual though, here are our 3 book recommendations. The first is Shipbuilders, An Industrial History of US Naval Shipbuilding, 1922 to 1945, by Thomas Heinrich, for a look at how the US governments in the past have tackled this particular issue. The second is US Naval Air Power in the 21st Century, A New Strategy for Facing the Chinese and Russian Threat, by Brent D. Sadler, for a look at the overall state of the US Navy today. And the third being Case Studies in Defense Procurement, Volume 2, From Ancient Rome to the Astute-class submarine. Thus, whilst the book's about a decade old now, it is still a pretty good overview on how procurement works on a very broad basis. I also want to thank this week's guests, John Konrad, Emma Salisbury, Matthew Fanioli, and Thomas Shugart. It was absolutely amazing to have you all on for this one. I'd also like to give additional thanks to the primary researchers for this piece, them being Raul Devanarayanan, Andrew Gundel, Gabriel Lane, Jonah Gunn, Lorenz van Kierbilk, and Nick McNally. As you can probably tell, this one was a pretty difficult one to put together. In addition, I'd also like to thank the rest of my team, including Cameron Gale, the producer, Jack Shankman, the production manager, Daniela Givella, Nato Stiller, Robbie Sutton, Nick McNally, Jemima Pentreath, Ben Nutter, Genevieve Dolan May, Perry Grace, Gabriel Lane, Lorenz van Kierbilk, Ben Spencer, Andrew Gundel, Isaac Gibbs, Scott Misler-Ferguson, and Sean Cottelem, our research assistants and writers, Jamie Tanner, our media director, Raul Devanarayanan, our OSINT analyst, Francis Leach, our director of breaking news, Mark Spencer, our second voiceover artist, Kashyap Maheshwari and Alexander Vulgarden from our online team, Jonah Gunn, our production assistant, Alexi Heimakainen, our Discord moderator, Joe Hawthorne, our audio cleaner, Marissa Rafter, our videographer, and Nick Mutch, our field correspondent. I cannot wait to see what this team will produce going into 2025. For now though, we'll be back in a few weeks with another international episode. But until then, I hope you have a happy holiday. Thank you for listening, and good night.
The views and opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of Michael, our guests, and the Redline Podcast. They do not represent any government or organization and are solely our own. For more information, please visit theredlinepodcast.com.